All right. Well, hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Jordan Przinski, and I serve as the Director of Membership with Good Business Colorado. Good Business Colorado is a coalition of over 250 values-driven businesses who are committed to building a prosperous, equitable, and sustainable Colorado. GBC members understand that we have a role to play in shaping public policy that impacts our communities and our businesses. Before we kick off today's town hall, we'd like to say thank you to all of our amazing co-sponsoring organizations, the African Chamber of Commerce, Colorado, Be Local Colorado, the Center for Community Wealth Building, Colorado Black Chamber of Commerce, the Commons on Champa, Entrepreneurship for All, Latino Chamber of Commerce of Pueblo, Pueblo West Chamber of Commerce, Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, Rocky Mountain MicroFinance Institute, and Small Business Majority, and the Startup Colorado. Thank you all so very much. Just a couple of quick things. After today's presentation, you will receive a follow-up email that contains a feedback form. We'd love to hear about your experience on today's town hall. There's also more information about each of our sponsoring organizations, so we encourage you to take a few minutes to learn a little bit more about our amazing partners here. For now, I'll go ahead and pass it on to Karen Moldovan, Director of Policy for Good Business Colorado, to tell us more about today's panelists.
Thanks so much, Jordan, and hi, everybody. We're just thrilled you were able to join us on this Friday afternoon for this conversation. So just to let folks know a little bit more about who we're going to be speaking with today and how we're going to facilitate this dialogue. We are thrilled. We're first going to be hearing from U.S. Senator Michael Bennet, and then next we'll hear from Francis Padilla, the Colorado District Director of the United States Small Business Administration, or SBA. And then third, we'll hear from Cher Havand, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, or CDLE. So each of them is going to give a few minutes of opening remarks just to update us on their work and their efforts to support small businesses. And then we'll segue to a moderated question and answer. So you all have the question and answer box. Myself and Hunter from Small Business Majority will be triaging your questions and answering them, giving them to the appropriate panelists. So please be thinking about your questions and use that Q&A box. And I think we will get ready to turn it over to our three presenters. And again, we're just thrilled to have them with us this afternoon. Let's see. I wonder if we might be having a little bit of technical difficulties with the U.S. Senator's office.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Great to see you.
Sorry about unfortunately, I have to reboot my computer every time I have a Zoom call, which in the era of COVID is not all that useful. So anybody who knows how to fix that, I'll give you $1 billion. So anyway, I'm here. So whenever you guys are ready, I'm ready.
I think we'll just go ahead and turn it over to you. But again, thank you so much for being here with us, Senator Bennet. And we would just love to turn it over to you to talk about what you've been working on, some of the most pressing issues you're seeing for small businesses, and engage in some of that dialogue.
Great. And I'd love to spend most of the time in a conversation with all of you. And since I'm 4 minutes late, I'm going to make my introductory comments that much briefer, but I want to thank you and Good Business Colorado for inviting me to be here with all of you today. I can't thank all of you enough for making the time. I hope everybody is staying safe. Before I get into the Q&A, I guess I'd make a few points about what we're seeing in terms of the protests today. I might spare you the long speech I usually give the young people that come to see me, but after they've been to see the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, the Supreme Court, and everything else, there's a tendency for them to think that it was all sort of just there, and the Washington Mall. And I point out that none of it was there 230 years ago. It was just somebody's ideas, and in fact, that the building that they were sitting in the U.S. Capitol, is a building that was built by enslaved human beings and who would still be enslaved if it hadn't been for other Americans and enslaved human beings to do the work that the founders didn't do. And we're seeing the effect of a straight line that I think you can draw from slavery to Jim Crow, to the redlining in our banking and housing industries, to the mass incarceration that we have. And so think that the peaceful protests that we're having are welcome, and my hope is that we're going to be able to make some important changes. It's incredible that all of this is enacting itself or acting out at a moment when we're facing a pandemic that is the worst health crisis of my lifetime, or certainly one of them, and we're contending with the worst economic challenges that we've seen since the Great Depression, and the damage to our small businesses has been particularly hard to see. The stay-at-home orders, which we needed to keep everyone safe, were really hard on our small businesses. Only 1 in 4 in this country have enough cash to stay in business for 3 months. Many have 2 weeks of cash left. Many have less than that. More than 40% think it will be at least 6 months before they can return to normal, to pre-crisis levels. And that's especially true of our hardest hit businesses in Colorado, like restaurants and breweries, salons, hotels, and seasonal sectors like tourism. It's a big deal that we were able to make the changes to PPP that we did this week, that we extended it beyond the 8 weeks, and that we made it more generous in terms of the way it can be administered. But I don't think it's anywhere near enough to what we really need. And I've got a bill that I wrote, was lucky enough to get a guy named Senator Young from Indiana. He's a Republican, to sign on to the bill. It's called the Restart Act. And basically what this is meant to do is create a new loan program that in addition to fixing the PPP program, creates a new loan program that would allow businesses to borrow the working capital they need over the next 6 months, and then pay it back over 7 years. So the PPP bill that we passed this week had some of the ideas that Young and I had in our original bill. They extended PPP from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. They created more flexibility to the so-called 75-25 rule, where small businesses had to spend 75% on payroll and no more than 25%, that we changed that to 60 and 40% respectively. I would have liked it to have been more generous, but I think that at least this is a step in the right direction. The way the Restart bill would work is that it would give our hardest hit businesses support to cover their working capital over the next 6 months for things like payroll, benefits, and other fixed costs, so they can stay afloat as the economy begins to reopen and recover. We've structured the support to increase flexibility. So under our proposal, businesses would pay no interest in the first year, no principal in the first 2 years. They'd have a total, as I mentioned, of 7 years to pay back the loan. Finally, a portion of the loan would be forgiven based on how much of the revenues are in decline this year compared to the last year. So to make it more concrete, if you're a restaurant in Denver whose revenues are down 50% compared to last year because essentially no one's been dining out over the last 3 months and you can't get up, fully up and running, under our bill, you'd not only get a flexible new loan, almost half of that loan would be forgiven to reflect the massive hit that you've taken this year. To my mind, this is the kind of smart, flexible support our small businesses in Colorado need. As I mentioned, it's the only bipartisan proposal in the Senate to deal with in the next 6 months. So I actually feel optimistic that in another COVID bill, if there is another COVID bill, we'll be able to get this done. And I guess the last point I'll make is that our state and local governments are hurting in a very profound way. Our state government's down 25%. Our county governments are down anywhere between 30% and literally 70%. Gilpin County is down 70%, hardest hit county in the United States of America. So I think there's more we could do there too if we can get this bill passed. So with that, let me just say thanks. And by the way, I'm happy to take questions or comments or criticism on any topic. Don't feel the need to restrict yourself to anything that I talked about. I'd love to hear what all of you would like to talk about. And that's how I learn stuff, and don't feel worried about hurting my feelings. After I was in business and before I was in the Senate, I was the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools. And you spend 4 years as an urban school superintendent, what you discover is all your feelings have been beaten out of you a long time ago. And that means you can't hurt them now. So let me turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that, the way you started the conversation, and know we're going to cover a lot in the next hour. I think we're going to hear next from Frances Padilla with the Small Business Administration.
Thank you so much to Good Business Colorado, and thank you, Senator Bennet, for having me on today and giving me the opportunity to provide you some updates on SBA programs and our materials and resources that are related to COVID-19 as they currently stand. And I put a big emphasis on that, as they currently stand. As you all know, this program has been in flux or fluid, as we say, over the course of the last 3 months. And I think for good reason, as the good senator said, and we started out with a pandemic of a proportion and ended up in a proportion that none of us could have anticipated. And so, we have to be as flexible as possible. We realize, especially here at the SBA, to provide as much assistance as we can to small businesses that are really hurting. And every day, my team and I talk to small businesses and nonprofit organizations, agricultural producers, etc., throughout the state that are in pain. And it really does hit our hearts. And even though we are not the policymakers or the lawmakers, we are the humble implementers of anything that's passed down. And I want you to know that we do currently stand to try to give as much information to our small businesses in Colorado as possible. I want to update you on a few things. I know it's been a while since I've been on with this group, so let me give you a few updates. On small business debt relief that's offered by the SBA. This is Pre-CARES Act. If you had an SBA disaster loan from another disaster period, this doesn't include the economic injury associated with COVID right now, but early on the SBA administrator made the decision to provide relief and deferred those payments for a period of 12 months. That's already happened. It happened administratively. You don't have to do anything or request anything. It was already done. So you will not be, those payments are deferred now at least through March or April of next year. Also under the CARES Act, current 7A Community Advantage 504 loans and SBA microloan borrowers were also relieved of actually the obligation to pay principal and interest and any associated fees that were owed on loans that were in regular servicing status. That means they were in good standing for a period of 6 months period, beginning with the first payments that were due after the end of March. Lenders subsequently submitted their documentation, and we continue to make those payments on behalf of existing SBA borrowers that are in good standing. This debt relief may come as a surprise to some that it also may apply and extend to new SBA guaranteed loans. These are not PPP loans or the EIDL loans, but any new 7A Community Advantage 504 or SBA microloans that are closed and dispersed through September 27th, 2020. So if you do get a new SBA loan and you close and disperse, then you too can take advantage of some of that debt relief payment. In terms of materials in other languages, the CARES Act also gave us a little bit of administrative authority to try to reach more underserved communities. So we're now providing PPP program and other related materials in languages other than English to help small business owners navigate through all of our COVID-related resources. Presently, the materials are available in 17 different languages. We will be translating more materials and posting periodically. And of course, we will now need to go back into any materials to reflect changes in the recently passed PPP Flexibility Act. But if you want to find that info, you would go to sba.gov, you click on the COVID banner, and then you scroll down to the other languages section. Moving on to EIDL loans and EIDL advances. Around the beginning of May, the EIDL Rapid Portal opened to accept new applications from agricultural enterprises, and that was authorized by Congress under CARES Act 2.0. And so this was the first time in history ever that the EIDL program has been open to agricultural producers and enterprises. And I know the senator will agree with me that this industry is vitally important to the economy in Colorado, and I want to thank him for his support on that. So right now, new applications from ag enterprises are the only new EIDL applications being accepted. If you already applied for EIDL and you received your advance, and your application starts with a 3, then you've taken all the steps you can until your long-term loan comes up in the queue for processing. If your application starts with a 2, and you never went back into the portal to reactivate your application, or you didn't receive an advance and you requested it, then please do not hesitate to email us at coloradodo@sba.gov, and we will get on that to help navigate that and make sure that you're in the queue. You do not need to apply again. You will not lose your place in line. We will just need to match up your original submission so you don't lose that place. Also, my understanding is that decision letters have been going out en masse over the last couple of weeks on EIDL long-term loans. If you have questions or you want to request reconsideration, the lender should provide you information on how to proceed. I apologize, but since this program is unilaterally administered by our Office of Disaster Assistance, district offices such as mine, we just don't have access to the systems to check statuses. But you can send your application number to Disaster Customer Service at SBA.gov, and what they do is create a ticket and answer those inquiries as they get through that queue. You can also call the Customer Service Center, and I'll make sure that you have the number. But quickly, it's 800-659-2955. We also have a TTY number, and we'll make sure we'll post this in the chat. I do want to give you progress numbers on EIDL programs in Colorado, and this is as of the end of last week. For EIDL advances, there were 62,343 different clients that received advances, and that totaled 198, a little over $198 million. On EIDL loans, and this was as of May 31st, we processed 14,132 long-term loans, and the dollars obligated were a little over $1.1 trillion, and that's all for Coloradans. Now on to PPP. So before we discuss the new act, I want to give you a couple of updates on PPP utilization to date. Through the second round of PPP funding, nationally, almost 4.5 million loans totaling over $510 billion made by 5,500 different lenders have been dispersed across the country. And this is for covering payroll for millions of jobs and supporting nearly every industry. As of the end of May in Colorado, there have been over 98,000 PPP loans valued at over $10.2 billion approved for Coloradans, and this is over the course of both rounds of funding. Just so you know, the average loan size in Colorado is a little over $104,000, which we hope indicates that we are getting money to some of the smaller sized businesses here. Now, I know it's not breaking news to anyone on this call, or really anyone in the country by now, that the Senate passed the PPP Flexibility Act a couple of days ago. I can briefly summarize the key provisions of what was in the act, but I want to give you an important disclaimer up front, and that is that the PPP program is jointly administered by both the SBA and the Department of Treasury. So once we have a final act that's signed, I presume that both agencies will begin furiously the process of promulgating the rules and guidance on implementing any of the changes, and of course, working to revise the current forgiveness application. So please excuse my inability today to answer any real technical and specific questions out there on the who, what, when, where, why, and how. I know mainly on the how, until we have that guidance officially in place. But in summary, here's what the Flexibility Act does and what it changes. It changes the covered period under which the loan proceeds can be used, as the Senator mentioned, from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. So instead of the period ending June 30th, it would actually end on December 30th of 2020. So that has the effect of extending that period for what our business can apply for forgiveness also from 6 months to 10 months of the last day of the covered period. And that's before you have to start making interest and principal payments. Also under the new bill, the PPP loan interest and payment of principal and fees will be deferred until the loan is forgiven by the lender. Borrowers can use that 24-week period to restore their workforce levels and wages to pre-pandemic levels required for that full forgiveness. The current PPP borrowers can choose to extend the 8-week period, or they can keep the original 8-week period. The new PPP borrowers will have that 24-week covered period, but that covered period can extend again beyond 12/30/2020. It also lowered the requirement to spend the amount on payroll from 75 to 60% in order to maximize that forgiveness, or I guess a better way of saying is that you may now use up to 40% to cover those eligible overhead expenses. So hopefully this provides some more flexibility to address additional costs associated with the interest on mortgage obligations and the payment of any covered rent obligations and any covered utility payments. The Act also increased the time to request forgiveness, as I mentioned, from 6 to 10 months, and that's to accommodate the extended covered period. It changed the maturity on any loan from 2 years to 5 years. For existing PPP loans, you can negotiate with your lender, according to the Act, to extend that maturity up to 5 years if you both agree on that. Of course, new PPP recipients will have the 5-year maturity. The interest rate still remains at 1%. PPP recipients may now also delay payments of payroll taxes, which was previously prohibited under the CARES Act to prevent a double dipping. The legislation also includes 2 new exceptions that allow borrowers to achieve full forgiveness even if you don't fully restore your workforce. So previous guidance already really allowed borrowers to exclude employees who had turned down good faith offers to be rehired for the same hours and the same wages before the pandemic. But now the new bill will allow borrowers to adjust just because they could not find qualified employees or they weren't able to restore business operations to the levels before the pre-pandemic because of operating restrictions and rules that are promulgated like by HHS or OSHA or CDC. In case you're wondering, there are more funds available. There are over $100 billion remaining to fund new PPP loans. And with that, I will stand to questions.
Thank you. That was such a helpful overview, and we know there's a lot of moving pieces with all of this, so we appreciate the update. Before we go to question and answer, we're just going to turn it over to Cher Havind from the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment to give us a briefing on that office. And then again, folks, please type in your question and answer, and we will get through as many as we can in our remaining time.
Thank you, Karen. I'll keep my remarks brief because I certainly want to get to the participant questions, but thank you, Senator Bennet, for your leadership and your staff. They've been great to work with as we consider policy options to help Colorado's economic condition and workers. Thanks to Good Business Colorado for including us in this conversation. Sometimes the Labor Department gets excluded from very critical business-led conversations, and we tend to focus on the worker, but we certainly are here to support our entire state's workforce, and that includes over 180,000 employers within Colorado who are funding a lot of workforce support initiatives like unemployment insurance. So today I will just speak briefly about the state of unemployment in Colorado. I don't really need to spend a lot of time setting the landscape for where we were pre-COVID to where we are today. I have just a couple of data points that tell the story. March 9th, our department had 400 unemployment insurance claims. A week later, we had 4,400. A week later, we had 26,000. And so no system in the country was prepared to deal with the onset of demand for benefits and the speed with which the pandemic hit our agency, health departments, hospitals, and others obviously cannot be overstated. And so we moved as quickly as possible early on during mid-March to adjust, retool, reform, and update processes and systems to meet that demand. Fast forward to today, as of yesterday, we announced that through the week ending May 30th, we've paid over 517,000 claimants, a total of nearly $2 billion in unemployment assistance benefits. That includes pandemic unemployment assistance and pandemic unemployment compensation that were now provided under the CARES Act. We did see a little bit of a logjam on claims the last 2 weeks in March, which we worked to address through a number of solutions, including virtual town halls, partnerships with our congressional leaders like Senator Bennett's office to get information out to Coloradans who were now suddenly unemployed and navigating a system they had never had to engage with before. We added staff to our call center. We implemented some how-to video guides on our website, and some of you may hear from your workers or neighbors, friends, family, we are still overwhelmed and we are attempting to meet the demand to help support those newly unemployed. I will tell you that there's been a lot of national attention to states who have had a backlog in processing their initial claims. Colorado has performed quite well in this space. We've actually paid more than 86% of initial claims filed for us with us. Some other states are still struggling to get those benefits out the door. In fact, we worked recently with Senator Bennett's staff and a few others with Aspen Institute on a policy that was released last week that because we were able to get these benefits out at a higher rate after initial claims, it is able to reduce the eviction risk factor. And so that's a report that was released last week by the Bell Policy Center. So there is some good work going on, although we do realize that so many Coloradans are still struggling to make ends meet, and certainly for the 14% who are waiting for their benefit payment, we are working expeditiously to get those benefits to them. Since this is a business-focused conversation, I just want to touch on a few things that the department's done to help ease the burden on business when they are struggling so hard to return to normal and return their workforce to 100%. One of the issues we're hearing from employers is the struggle, as Francis said, to make their workforce whole. The pandemic unemployment compensation provides for $600 a week and extra unemployment insurance. The average weekly UI benefit amount in Colorado is about $450. And so we have seen some struggles with restaurant and hospitality, leisure in returning their workforce to whole. And so our goal is to educate both the workers and the employers on their rights and responsibilities. From the workers' perspective, when they're certifying to us every week or every other week, depending on what kind of benefit they're on, that they're able, available, and soon actively seeking work because we will reinstitute a work search requirement, they must tell us if they've refused any suitable offer to return to work. And in that certification, they will answer a series of questions, and that certification enables us to determine their continued eligibility to receive unemployment insurance. On the employer side of the house, employers also have the opportunity to report to us if they have asked their workers to return and made a suitable offer of work, and that offer is refused. We stood up a form on our website so that employers could report this to us. We've had about 1,400 submissions so far. And of those that have had a decision made on those, which is about 800, 17% of those were determined that in fact the employer had made a suitable offer to return, had implemented appropriate safety protocols within the workplace, including masks, sanitization stations, social distancing. And so we have to strike a balance between what's in the best interest of the worker, on the other hand, want to support our employer community and help you rebuild the workforce because you've all taken such a hit. We also passed a few emergency rules to help provide support to employers. We have a work share program. Pre-COVID, we were struggling to get employer participants, and we were hovering around a couple of dozen. Today, we have over 1,200. This is a program that allows an employer to, it's a layoff aversion tactic, reduce your hours within your workforce and spread them across your workers so that you can also be paying partial wages while they are collecting partial unemployment. Right now during COVID, those benefits are not charged to employers' unemployment premium accounts. It is a really valuable tool when an employer is looking at averting any kind of a layoff option. So we've seen amazing growth in that program. Right now we have a bill up before our legislature that will provide some flexibilities within work share plans provided by employers. And again, those charges would not be charged against the employer's account. If I failed to mention that, that's a critical piece to this. Which kind of leads me to trust fund solvency, which was part of my remarks. So as you all know, you are paying into the state's unemployment insurance trust fund. This fund is funded by premiums that you're paying on the wages to your workers and a number of other mechanisms. We saw this fund go bankrupt 3 times before, in the 80s, in the early 2000s, and again during the Great Recession. We have never failed to pay unemployment insurance benefits in the state, because at the point at which this fund does become insolvent, we've been able to borrow from the federal government at either low or no interest rates. And so fast forward to today, we are at about $600 million balance in that fund. We do anticipate to see that go insolvent, as almost every other state does, due to the unprecedented demand for benefits, probably sometime in July or early August. The plan at that time would be to take advantage of the federal borrowing at no interest offered within the CARES Act through the end of this year, at which time we would, and actually not at which time, now, in fact, we are engaging the business community, coalition of business leaders throughout the state, to explore return to solvency solutions like we've done in previous economic downturns. During the Great Recession, we actually engaged the business community to explore a bonding solution, which allowed us to pay off the debt sooner and provide quicker relief to employers who are paying into the fund. So I do know we had a question submitted in on trust fund solvency and exploring solutions to that. And I would just say that the department is working actively with our state leaders and our congressional leaders on options to help return those funds to solvent. And certainly it's a conversation that is led by the business community, as it has been in past economic downturns, and we hope to continue those conversations going forward. So with that, I will close, and thanks for having us.
Thank you so much to all three of our presenters. That was a really helpful overview. So the question that you mentioned on the issue of unemployment insurance solvency, there was kind of a second part to that question that I'll also share with Senator Bennet around, is this an issue where there is essentially like a state-federal interplay where possibly we could look at longer term forgiveness or low interest rates or no interest rates to the states as a part of the HEROES package or ongoing COVID relief, so that states have some federal support in addressing this unemployment insurance?
Yeah, I think we're certainly open to any idea like that to try to relieve the immediate cash flow problem and replenish the fund. So I don't have a good thought about that right now, but I think we should stay in touch on it.
Absolutely. So I think our next question is going to come from Hunter Raley, the Colorado State Director of the Small Business Majority.
Thanks, Karen. So we also have another question here relating to PPP, and I think this person is asking, they're in the transportation business. Why didn't PPP include any transportation related expenses? And I think just to broaden that out a little bit, I think one of the main issues we've seen with this program is that payroll is in many cases not the primary expense, or is less significant, and overhead, inventory, and increasingly PPE are some pretty substantial expenses. So I think just in general, how should businesses navigate that, and what may be coming for them?
Yeah, first of all, I think you're totally right about this. The initial take on this, the 75-25, was not part of the original legislation. It was a regulation that the Treasury Department put in place, which I never thought made any sense. Now we're at 60-40, so that is a broader array of allowable expenses than the 75-25. The Restart Act, which even the one I mentioned earlier, the loans to businesses for the next 6 months, it's a much broader definition, so that we can allow the use of flexibility for funds to use them on business needs that make sense to the businesses rather than that make sense to at a certain moment in time to Washington. So we have made it slightly more flexible in the new PPP version. I hope that if we pass more small business relief in the second COVID package, it will be much broader than what we've seen before.
Thank you so much. So as you can imagine, we do have a lot of questions about sort of the shifting landscape of the PPP loan. So some of these questions may be well directed to Francis Padilla, but questions around, do folks need to change their PPP loan forgiveness from 8 weeks to 24 weeks? Or do folks can they reapply under these new terms if they already had received PPP many weeks ago?
I think
access, yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're still waiting for, this is a fresh new bill, not even signed from the White House yet. So we have two agencies that administer this program. So they know there's some little bit of lag time in there. Give us a couple of days to get some rules out. But in general, the way that CARE Act reads, if you already have the PPP, then you basically have some flexibility to opt into some of the new provisions. If you get it fresh, obviously they apply directly. But I mean, it's really kind of a conversation between you and any resource partner you might have about whether it makes sense right now. If you've been able to fully open and utilize the money for forgiveness up to 75%, and you don't have any problem with that right now, and you want to put in your forgiveness application, and we're coming up, on the first period, right after the first CARES Act authorized this for people who maybe took advantage of the early PPP money to be able to do so. If this doesn't make sense for you, or if you're in one of the industries that has been severely impacted by a slower rollout of full opening, then it would make sense to opt in for a longer period.
Thank you. To bounce around a little bit, Senator, along the lines of anybody throw out anything, one of our constituents is asking for you to at least consider co-sponsoring the CASE Act, bill number 1273, for creators, photographers, songwriters, illustrators. And then to follow up on the PPP idle loan distinction, we've gotten several questions for folks that were able to get the $10,000 advance and then also got a PPP loan. How does that interact with those loans? Or are we to understand that that $10,000 advance, or any advance money they receive through the idle loan program, does not impact their PPP loan?
Well, actually, as the interim final rules stand right now on PPP, the formula would be that any advance that you had, idle advance you had, would limit the amount of forgiveness. Now, how it's going to interplay now with new rules, I don't know. We are seeing people who are also even being funded for the idle long-term loans, and so we're expecting a more formal policy on the interaction actually between all three of those.
And I'd be glad to take a look at the CASE Act. I'll look at it. Thanks.
Thank you. So the next question is actually one that I just received via text, and I think I'll put it out there to all three panelists. But throughout this pandemic, we have unfortunately seen businesses owned by communities of color really struggle with being able to access formal relief and recovery efforts for various reasons, certainly depending on maybe access to 7(a) lenders, meeting some of the requirements. So kind of as an open question, what are your offices and teams doing, and where do you see some real opportunities to be sure that our businesses owned by communities of color are able to fully access resources and recovery at this really critical time for our nation?
Francis, do you want to take a stab at that, or you want me to go? I'm happy to. I think that, it's so often the case with these kinds of things, when you have a downturn like this, the businesses that are larger, the businesses that have lawyers and accountants and pre-existing relationships, in particular with banks and other lending institutions, can navigate the process and jump to the front of the line. And I think we've seen that in Colorado, and we've seen that across the country. It's one of the reasons why we had to re-top up the PPP loans as soon as we could. One of the things we're doing in the restart bill that I mentioned earlier, which we're trying to get passed as part of the next bill, is doubling down on our support for CDFIs, the community development financial institutions. That's a really valuable way to get funding to the smallest businesses and to minority-owned, women-owned, and to rural businesses. I think we also need to set aside funding for smaller restart loans so that smaller businesses don't have to compete with larger businesses. It's just not equitable, and it's not fair, because some of our hardest hit businesses fall into those categories. And then I would finish by saying, this is an issue that I've been working on for the last 20 years as a local, after being in business as a local official, and then in the school district, and now being at the federal government. And what I can tell you is we just need a more robust infrastructure in Colorado for minority and women-owned businesses than the one that we have. I think that you know, we've got to, it's really critical to the future of this state and the future of the country that we make more of a commitment there. We're trying to do it in this legislation, but I think post-pandemic, we really need to assess what else we can do.
To jump on that, I'll let you know what SBA's done in terms of the steps to ensure that PPP funds would be available to small businesses, particularly those in socially and economic disadvantaged communities, and where we know, you know, the percentage of unbanked or the underbanked is dramatically higher than perhaps in other wealthier communities. So to address that disparity on one level, what the SBA did was expand the number of authorized PPP lenders that included more CDFIs and minority depository institutions that could participate in our fund. In fact, in Colorado, between round 1 and round 2, we actually added 31 different lenders that SBA had never worked with before. Many of them were mission-based lenders, some of them were credit unions, some of them were other types of CDFIs, some were even farm credit institutions. And I think though it was very promising for us, at least here in my district office, to know that we would be working with a lot of lenders that were kind of hitting more impact communities, not just minority businesses, but also in rural areas. And I really appreciate the participation. Also, I think to strengthen that, we just announced that we are going to set aside $10 billion more in PPP in the round 2 funding to be lent exclusively by CDFIs. And we all know that their primary mission is really to expand economic opportunity in low-income communities. And so our hope is that by dedicating these funds, we can further ensure that PPP reaches all the communities that need relief.
Thank you. Kind of pivoting a little bit towards the specifics of PPP. So now that we're getting close to at least what was initially planned to be the end of the first 8 weeks for the first rollout, this person would like specific guidance on what exactly, what employer taxes are considered forgivable. And then I think just to broaden that out a little bit too, I think we've had, I know on small business majority side, a lot of folks that asking questions around this forgiveness piece, and just where would you suggest those folks direct specific questions about their loans or any line items that they may be working with that would go into that?
There's a couple of different ways you can approach technical assistance. We're really lucky in Colorado because we really do have a cadre of collaborations and partners that are willing to work with small businesses. Many of them are organization sponsors for this event. So again, we appreciate their participation. One, you can start with the district office. I have a division called Lender Relations Specialists, and it's their job to work through and navigate our lending products and also to work with borrowers to kind of understand all the moving pieces. Second, we, from the very beginning of this crisis, from the federal government and the state and all the way down, we actually entered into rapid response teams throughout the state of Colorado. Those include, of course, SBA, OEDIT, the Rural Prosperity folks, Startup Colorado, our SBDCs, our Women's Business Center, our SCORE chapters, especially our SBA resource partners. We fund them so that they can provide low-cost or no-cost technical assistance and mentoring back to small businesses. So all you really need to do is set up an appointment with one of our resource providers, and they become a mentor for free and can add other components and other consultants in subject matter expertise like accounting or legal, etc., that can help navigate through some of these questions. You could also work with any of the third-party payroll providers or, you know, the consultants that exist in private industry. We don't really have a prohibition for that, but I would say, at least from my perspective, that you would try one of our resource partners first because the service is free.
If I could add real quick too, you know, we do have a network, a statewide network of workforce centers throughout Colorado, Denver Metro and rural. And so they are focused on helping job seekers with training and reemployment assistance, but we also do have business development specialists who work closely with the SBA and the SBDCs at the local level to connect them with financial support and assistance, assistance with layoff aversion programs, retraining, skills upgrading. So those are also local and statewide resources available.
Great. Thank you all for that. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to a question that I received via direct message, but around this issue of business interruption insurance. And this may not be on the three of yours kind of docket right now, but I wanted to mention it, where we have a lot of small businesses who have been paying their business interruption insurance, diligently for years, and then have been unable to, have not been able to file claims related to pandemic loss of business. So us in trying to help navigate folks with that, we are not even sure, is this a state or a federal policy issue? Are you all hearing conversations regarding insurance regulation, and how can we support businesses that have been unable to file any claims around pandemic loss?
Yeah, actually, I've heard a lot about this across the state, and the history here is interesting. First of all, as you know, insurance is regulated at the state level, so that's where the primary regulator is going to be, but there's a role for federal policy here. As you may know, the origins of this were another pandemic. It was the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. A lot of business interruption insurance plans wrote pandemics out of their coverage. And now what they would say is that they weren't collecting premiums to cover that, and that a risk like a pandemic is something that affects businesses in the country in the same way. So it's hard to insure against. I don't have a view of that, but I think it's going to be incredibly important for us to figure out what we can do. What we can do federally is to essentially help businesses weather the coming months, and that's going to take more of a federal response. That's why we put forward the Restart program I mentioned earlier, which is a much more generous loan terms and loan forgiveness on account of revenues lost, which basically acts as insurance. I mean, that's the way it really works, is insurance against being able to get fully up and running in the next 6 months. We also have to figure out whether there should have a federal backstop for business interruption insurance for pandemics going forward, so we don't end up in this situation again. But I think I'd be misleading you if I said that I hold out a lot of hope that we're going to be able to get the insurance companies to pay up in the context of the current pandemic.
Thank you. So we have another question about unemployment insurance. So this participant has applied for unemployment on April 6th and still has not had their claim processed. They're struggling to get through to customer service. Is there another way to get help, or a preferred way to get through to the office?
Certainly, and I think I acknowledged at the beginning of the call that our call center does continue to see overwhelming demand for in-person, actual agent assistance. So I apologize for that frustration. I would say it depends on the type of claim that they have. If they are on a pandemic unemployment assistance claim, we actually have a dedicated call center. We contracted with an outside vendor. That call center is pretty accessible, and you're able to get through quite quickly. The other call center is still experiencing long hold times and incredible volume. There are a number of things that this person can do. We are now, if they're in Denver Metro, we are taking on-site appointments starting next Wednesday. They can schedule an on-site appointment where they can connect with an agent that way at our office in downtown Denver. If they're outside of Denver Metro, I would suggest they visit their local workforce center, who can also connect them and hopefully get them resolution to their issue. If they filed in April, there's likely something technical going on with their claim. We are anticipating less than 2 weeks from the time a claim is submitted until it is actually moved through the process for payment. So there likely is something technical going on, but either an on-site appointment if Denver Metro, if it's a PUA claim, they can get through to that call center. That number is at coloradoui.gov. If they're outside of Denver Metro, the workforce centers are operating on virtually or through reduced hours, and they could get assistance that way.
Great, thank you so much. So this is probably a quick clarifying question for the SBA and Francis. If a business hasn't applied for an EIDL loan yet, are they still able to, or is the time sort of passed for EIDL relief?
Right now, the only new applications we're taking for EIDL are from the agricultural industry.
Thank you.
So a follow-up on PPP loans. I think one of the challenges too with, while the flexibility has been really appreciated and I think is needed for this program, this kind of puts business owners that applied and received loans in immediately in the first two rounds, where they were assuming their cash flow was going to be around 8 weeks and were planning around this. I think it's pretty clear that they are not going to be able to apply for a second round of funding. So I think, Senator, is this where what the legislation you were speaking to earlier would fit into that gap, or how should these businesses navigate that?
Absolutely. That's the reason for it. And what we're trying to do is provide the working capital for the next 6 months. I don't know if Francis wants to speak to the technical issues on PPP, but that is definitely what we're trying to do with the next COVID bill, is address that lag. I mean, the problem is so many businesses didn't actually need the money when it was available. They actually needed it later when they were opening again as a result of the orders coming off, and we're trying to sort of align with that business reality versus the imagined reality from Washington. Francis, I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add to that.
I think that's entirely right. I mean, for those that already have PPP, I think the only reason that you would want to expand into another funding cycle is that the limited use of proceeds, as you said. You know, it's not really for the majority of working capital costs. It's really specifically for payroll and for those real specific overhead expenses. And so to the extent that we all recognize that there are other expenses that a business is going to have, especially as they reconstitute, it's not the perfect tool. Applying for another PPP won't help. It'll still be a limited use of proceeds. I will let you know, in case you don't know, that the Office of Economic Development and International Trade from the very beginning has been compiling a repository of other sources. If you haven't seen this now, the last time I looked at it, it had like 180 different resources, not just SBA, not just federal, but it also talked about dealing with debt with your debtors, etc. To find that, go to choosecolorado.com and scroll down, and you'll find kind of a Google Doc that has all these different alternative sources.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, and then I think Senator Bennet is going to close us out. This is hopefully a quick question in terms of eligibility for 501c6 organizations, and are they eligible for PPP support in this new iteration?
I don't believe they are, and this has been a problem since the very beginning of the bill. They are eligible for the restart if we ever pass my bill with Senator Young, but not for PPP.
Thank
Great.
you.
So I think another quick question that is going to increasingly, that came from out of our network, that is increasingly going to be an issue as businesses start to reopen, is how do they procure PPE in quantities that is going to be able to support their operations, and how can they expect to navigate that?
Yeah, this is such a great question. So we went into this crisis with a totally insufficient PPE and with a supply chain that had migrated mostly to China, leaving us very vulnerable. Then, unfortunately, on top of that, we compounded the problem, because instead of having a national strategy, what we ended up doing was creating an environment where every single hospital in America was competing with every other hospital for PPE, and every governor was competing with every other governor. That's ridiculous in my view. I mean, there's a reason why we're one nation under God, and it's for dealing with a global pandemic. So what I hope is that we are making progress mending the supply chains, and it's not as fast as I would have liked. I think President Trump has not used the authorities that he might have used to get us more quickly back on our feet. And it's going to be a combination of producing more of it here at the same time that we're doing everything we can to continue to socially distance and do things like wear masks to try to keep the demand for PPE down in our hospitals. So in the long term, what we have to do is we got to reactivate a supply chain here in this country to manufacture the PPE that not only our frontline healthcare workers need, but our small businesses are going to need as a just a regular part of doing business from now on.
Thank you. And I think we're coming up on time. So Senator, I think just before everyone, before we end this, if you could offer us some thoughts on how these business owners can support legislative efforts, more clearly communicate with you and other members of the delegation, and then just any closing thoughts you might have.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to give our office phone number to you, and I'm trying to make sure I get the right one. But let me just say, you're doing it by having these calls, and I appreciate the depth of the question that's been asked so far. The small businesses have provided me with unbelievable amounts of input from the very beginning of the PPP program, through the reformation, through the extension, and now into this work that I'm doing with Senator Young from Indiana. So I want to say I really appreciate that. I hope you'll fight for another bill, COVID bill, so that going forward we've got the support that we need for state and local governments. We've got the support that we need for small businesses. And you don't need to wait for these calls to reach out to me. You can reach out to me anytime if you've got issues related to PPP, if you can't access your unemployment insurance, although Cher gave you a good number for that. But we work on that. You've got immigration concerns or anything else, just reach out to my office. My Denver office is 303-455-7600. And we're, Mitch McConnell today is saying we're not going to do another package, probably won't do another package. I think that's a negotiating position. I think that when he hears from all of you and people just like you all across the country, he's going to realize that our job is not yet done. And I don't think it is. So I want to thank you, by the way, for enduring this. This is an enormously difficult moment in the country's history. And I am really, really optimistic that not only will we come through it, but we're going to come through it realizing that we've got to start investing again in this country and in our people in ways that we haven't for the last 30 or 40 years. And that's going to make a difference to the next generation of Americans. So that's my optimistic note to end this conversation.
That's a fantastic way to end. Thank you so much, Director Padilla, Chair, Senator Bennet, and Jordan and Karen from Good Business Colorado team for organizing, along with Small Business Majority, Hunter and Lindsay. We are so appreciative of our co-sponsors of this event, the African Chamber of Commerce, Be Local Colorado, the Center for Community Wealth Building, the Colorado Black Chamber of Commerce, the Commons on Champa, Entrepreneurship for All, the Latino Chamber of Commerce of Pueblo, Pueblo West Chamber of Commerce, Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, the Rocky Mountain MicroFinance Institute, Small Business Majority, and Startup Colorado. This is part of a series of programming that we've put together to make sure that the small businesses across the state are able to weather this storm together. We will be sending you a survey today, and if you could please take a couple minutes to provide us on feedback on this event, as well as your ideas for content for future events. Our ability to be able to provide the resources and TA depends entirely on hearing from you what will be most helpful. So please continue to send us your ideas for programming. Thank you again so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Bye. See you.
Happy Friday, everybody.